Thank you. It's been, this talk is going to work in well with all the presentations that went beforehand. We've seen the results of a lot of the restoration activities that people have undertaken for the Bay. And where I wanted to go with this talk was to talk about where we're headed and how we might change our approaches to tidal marsh restoration down the road. So we've seen this photo a few times. This is the start of dirt moving around the bay in 1893 to construct dikes and levees and drain off our marshes. And I think we've seen this picture a few times in various formats. The area on the left is in green is the extent of our tidal marshes, what we believe what it was in 1870 as mapped. And you can kind of see in 2005 when Alderon prepared his atlas how much we lost. The area in dark gray is marsh that is now behind levees, drained and converted to agriculture and development. And only a few remnant marshes left. So starting about, I think, 30 years ago was the start of thinking about restoring marshes around Humboldt Bay. And really not until about 2005 did we really start getting on the ground and undertaking projects. And in that time, and when I say we, a vast community of the cities, the county, the various federal agencies, various engineering and restoration companies have worked together to implement a bunch of different projects all around the bay, some on the bayfront and some back in the estuaries. But as much as we've done with all these projects, it's kind of hard to see on the landscape. We've only kind of scratched the surface. But these projects have had a big impact. I think that the fisheries talks were great, in which we saw that restoring these marshes, creating off-channel habitats in our former tidelands has really enhanced the potential for fisheries, for growth of our endangered species. Tidewater goby 15 years ago were hard to find on the landscape. We would find them in 1 and 2s. And as Ross points out, now we find them in hundreds. And these are in new areas where there was no goby before. So we've created new habitat. But we also have to think about, we've had a big impact on the bird populations. Bird populations of shorebirds, migratory shorebirds has increased. And, recently it's been shown that Humboldt Bay is of hemispheric importance for shorebirds on the Western Flyway. So these marshes are enhancing the forage areas for birds as they migrate and increasing the potential for populations. And I think we've also gone through an evolution of ideas about how to restore marshes. We started out very simple with tide gate modifications, trying to restore tidal flow into channels. We've now evolved into a really good understanding of how to create landscapes in marsh plains that we can restore tidal marsh to. So looking forward, what's the potential for further marsh restoration in the area? These are the questions I wanted to ask with this talk. How will sea level impact marshes and our restored marshes as we move forward in Humboldt Bay? And should we be changing it up? What should we change in our approaches to do in marsh restoration? So one of the key drivers that we use in developing marsh restoration projects is the relationship between tidal elevations and landscape. So the amount of where the land is located relative to tides has a profound influence on what type of habitats we see in those areas. So at the upper range above mean high water to mean higher high water and maximum tide, that's where we find our tidal marshes. If we go lower into the tidal prism, the landscape becomes flooded too long and plants can't survive the combination of salinity and the lack of oxygen when the tide is up. But even further down, we have the mud flats that get periodically flooded and exposed on a daily basis. And that's one of the really key factors in our bird population is having that mud flat habitat where they can go out and forage and which supports algae and worms and diatoms and the whole base of the food chain. And then we have features out in the bay that we rarely think about, such as sandbars, which play a role in migratory birds. And then further down into through the tidal range, we have eelgrass. So that's our undeveloped profile. We looked at what has happened to our tidelands in drained conditions. Most of that land is now below, has subsided because of the combination of the organic soils decaying and being exposed to the air and compaction. But another factor is that the tidelands are blocked from sediment transport. So the sediment that used to go into those marshes is now kept out in the bay. And we've accumulated sediment out in the bay that's kind of locked out there from getting back into our marshes. And then on that landscape, we have a kind of a gradient of brackish water at the tide gates or the levees up to fresh water as we move inland. So I've developed this simple model. It's not a Jeff Anderson model. It doesn't have salinity or temperature or sediment in it, but it's a picture of where we can have tidal marshes and mudflats in Humboldt Bay. And this is based on current conditions. So areas that are around 5.8 feet to 8.5, that's where we find tidal marshes if they are outside the levee areas. That's the area that is that band between mean high water and the highest tides. From about 1.7 to 5.8, I've shown in yellow here, this is where we find our mudflat habitat. And if you can see kind of the black line around on the screen, that's the dike line. So if we look at the land upslope inboard of the dikes, there's lots of areas that have subsided and are now yellow. And then below that, we have areas that are blue, and that's either permanently flooded by subtidal areas, or if it's inboard of the dikes, it's areas that are within a foot of mean low water. And those areas are going to be flooded and too saturated to support vegetation. So taking a closer look, this is current conditions of what we see. We have extensive mudflats in North Bay, but the areas behind the dike on the north side, if the dikes were removed, would convert to mudflat. And we have a very narrow band of areas that are potential for salt marsh, where there's an elevation range is suitable that salt marsh would develop. Also note that the areas in Mad River Slough where there's islands that are still, they still have access to sediment and marsh plant growth, those are all healthy. They're all at an elevation. They've kept up with sea level rise. We also, looking further around this area, we see that Baylands, the Arcata property, is still in a good range for marsh development, but most of the freshwater basin in the south is very low and would turn to mudflat if we breach the levees. South Bay, we have extensive areas of mudflat outside of the Humboldt Bay Refuge. Within the refuge area, we have a huge extent of diked lands that are at a very low elevation. The one promising thing I love about this photo is Elk River. Elk River is in great shape and is potentially salt marsh if we move into that area. So we've seen projections of sea level rise, and it starts out slow and gets faster and faster. Now, there's a lot of different projections that we could argue about going intermediate or high, but Gary Griggs, a professor down south, said, it doesn't really matter how fast it occurs, it's going to occur. So we have to think about what are the impacts, and it's going to happen sooner or later that we're going to start seeing sea level rise impacts. So I'm just going with the intermediate here. Well, I got through there pretty quickly. So this is looking at 2070. This is adding a 1.7 feet or 1.8 feet of sea level rise to our tides. And look what happens to North Bay. The areas that were in mudflat now we've lost a lot of them because they're going to be permanently flooded. Now there may be some migration of eelgrass into that area, but there's a lot of that area that's now used for bird forage that's not available. If we look to 2100 with 3.3 feet, we see that most of that mudflat outside the dikes is gone away. And then if we look at the areas inboard of the dikes in North Bay, we see areas of blue inside that shoreline. That means that the water levels, groundwater level, and flooding has come up so much that there's not going to be any vegetation there. It's going to be a water trap behind the dikes on a flooded landscape that probably be hypersaline and very low productivity. We also see the same type of picture down in the freshwater basin, where much of the area inboard of the 101 is in the Fay Slough wildlife area, is not going to be supporting that habitat that's now used for ducks. South Bay looks even worse. So I didn't account for that South Bay is going down a lot quicker, but very quickly we're losing a lot of mudflat habitat in South Bay within the next 50 years. Much of the refuge land is now won't support vegetation. That's where a lot of the hunting takes place. That vegetation will be gone. It'll be converted to a brackish lake. And then if we look at 2100, that the whole refuge area is gone. There's no mud flats left. And even the Elk River starts to look kind of sketchy, as if we breach it then, it would be turning to mud flat. So that's kind of the picture of what happens if we do nothing. So putting this all together, so what's going to happen is, and I'm focused on conservation areas here, what supports our waterfowl and fish. So we're going to lose mudflat habitat. We're going to lose the remnant of salt marshes that we have. Areas behind the dikes are going to be chronically flooded, and they're going to lose agricultural productivity and lose the ability to serve as forage areas for our birds. We're also going to start to lose in-bay habitat features. I think you saw Waylon yesterday showed what's happening already with increased scour on the eelgrass beds, that we're losing eelgrass. We're going to lose those features. We're going to lose features of sandbars that are important for migratory birds. And then on top of it, remember Jeff's model, that how much increase in flow going in and out of the bay, that's going to increase the erosion around our levees, and infrastructure is going to increase the likelihood of failure. So the Department of Interior has developed a framework. I think USGS did most of this work, but it's called the RAD framework. And basically, it's a way to think about how to approach solving a ecological problem. So you can resist, try to maintain things as they are. You can accept, let them go forward and just let the pieces fall where they are. Or you can try to direct and actively steer your actions to maintain the system. So resisting, we would try to maintain the existing shoreline. That would require rebuilding, reinforcing the dikes, replacing the drainage infrastructure, increasing the size of it because it's going to become less effective as the tides come up, and maybe possibly fill lowlands to prevent vegetation drowning. That's going to be an expensive alternative, and even if we do that, we're going to lose a lot of ecological value. Accept, I think, is something that none of us in this room want to go that way. We'd lose a lot of agricultural lands. We'd lose a lot of critical avian habitat, chronic flooding. We'd have a locked-in, impaired ecological conditions. And this is already occurring. This is the refuge this winter. Water could not get out of the refuge because the tides were too high. So direct seems to be the attractive alternative. So I think one thing we have to think about is we have to restore geomorphic processes that support resiliency to sea level rise. That means remove barriers to marsh and mudflat migration. More importantly, restore the idea of moving sediment from the bay into the shoreline where the marsh processes and vegetation growth can trap that sediment and organic debris and increase the elevation naturally. We may need to modify lowlands to promote preservation of areas that we think are particularly valuable. So assessment-wise, active measures are going to be expensive. When we did the White Slough project, which we'll hear about in a bit, that worked out to be about $75,000 an acre to convert subsided marsh to marsh plain elevation. Passive measures are less expensive, but they're going to take more time. And the best way to, directed actions, I think, are going to be our best way to prevent and address the loss of ecological functions. So, fundamental strategy: restore the sediment transport to drain tidelands. This may require allowing the sediment to move in will allow sedimentation to occur, and that organic debris and sediment trapping will make the marsh plains grow and maintain their elevation with sea level rise. That can occur in our area because we have a hefty sediment supply, but at some point, the sea level rise rates are going to reach a point where it may outcompete that and drown the marshes. So this is McDaniel Slough, which was breached in 2014, and this is part of the plan. Phil Williams, who designed the initial project, figured it would take about 40 years for the marsh plain to trap sediment and accumulate and get up to the marsh plain elevation that was there, that we were hoping to get in, by the end of the project. So you can see in 2016, after the first vegetation die-off, almost all of the area is mudflat. And then 4 years later, we start to see little islands of vegetation occur. And by 2024, this spring, you can see that that vegetation is spread out. What's happening is that vegetation is growing into the ground. It's bulking up the soil, raising the actual marsh plain. It's also trapping sediment that gets carried in by the tides. So we're accumulating sediment and coming back to marsh plain. That's passive action, and it works. Active sediment augmentation also works, but it's only going to work if you restore the sediment inputs for the long term. You also have to provide a combination space for mudflat retreat. And an issue that I think, again, we'll talk about in a little bit, it's difficult to find quality soil. You really need a good clay silt soil to put on the marsh plain to make marsh plain functions happen. It's a viable strategy if we have high value conservation lands we want to preserve. And this could be an important use of beneficial reuse of dredge spoil. But again, we have to have the right sediment. It's got to be clay silt, not sand. Something else we might think about is the shoreline reset. We've damaged our shoreline, and we need to reset the shoreline back from where it was because the ground has subsided. So some of the ideas I have for this is that we would remove or breach dike. We can leave portions of it in place to serve as a wave break. We can harvest nearshore sediment to create suitable depths for eelgrass. That sediment can then be used to create marsh further back. And then with that reset shoreline, if we restore the tides and sediment transfer, we have a shoreline that can adapt to sea level rise. So kind of coming full circle here with the dredges. Close comments, just, we need to address sea level rise to preserve our conservation, ecological resources, and agricultural resources. We're going to need innovative strategies for moving dirt around, and we need to provide and replace lost in-bay features that occur as the sea level rise occurs. So that means that, at this point, we've always focused on marsh plains, but we may need to start thinking about putting in mud flats, eelgrass beds, possibly even oyster reefs. So that's it. One last picture for discussion. This is my poetry. We got the gray skies above, the rainbow in the background. Hopefully we can go chase the rainbows.